All right, it is 3 o'clock, and it is the last whistle stop for our train, keep them on time. And we have a terrific final panel who are already discussing their questions vigorously, but not at the table. So we're going to invite them up to the panel table. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the final panel, and that's Ladine Freemuth. You know, we've heard some things about the role of policy in leading the markets and in leading innovation and in leading customers and companies in the right directions. And Ladine is a master of policy. That's where she comes at this from. She's been in Washington and has done a lot of work on the Hill, going back to, for example, the 2007 Act that Steve was mentioning. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ladine, and she can launch our final. And lightning's going to strike in this panel, folks. Watch my words.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. As John said, I'm Ladine Freemuth. I have my own energy and environmental consulting firm called the Freemuth Group, and I consult to Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, as well as Gridwise Alliance and a number of other clients in this area. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. We are last, but I promise this will be a stimulating panel, and I will let our panelists introduce themselves in a moment. Just to briefly set the stage, a lot has been said already today. Of course, this last topic is quite timely, talking about the benefits, capturing the benefits at every scale and every level. And we have, as Steve mentioned, the energy bill on the floor of the United States Senate as we speak, and it's called the Energy Policy Modernization Act. And certainly this bill aims to highlight and provide the policies to facilitate the forward movement of grid modernization. And it will provide programs, incentives, and some of the frameworks that we need to move this process of grid modernization forward. And we've heard throughout the day how we need the technologies and the benefits and limitations of these technologies, but it can't be addressed in isolation. We need the policies, as I was just mentioning, as well as the economics, the markets, and a whole range of issues if we're going to have grid modernization and accomplish it in a comprehensive manner. And we need to look at the customer side as well, as has also been mentioned. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We're going to start with Travis Bradford and go from there. And I look forward to a great last discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Travis Bradford. I'm the director of the Energy and Environment Concentration here at SEPA. I also teach over the Business School and through the Earth Institute's Sustainability Management Program. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes? You in the back, can you hear me? All right. And prior to that, I've done a number of things, not worth going into a long detailed list, but I have a background in finance, did a lot of work in solar, and helped to launch a market research firm that many of you may know called Green Tech Media through the Prometheus Institute that I started. Also helped Jigger start the Carbon War Room and a bunch of other things that you've probably never heard of. But I think hopefully made a good contribution each in their own way. But today I teach and write. I'm just finishing up a textbook on the energy system, which I think talks a lot about this integration of technology, economics, markets, and policy around these issues. I think that some of the juiciest ones are in electricity transformation, electricity sector transformation, and to that end, we've hosted a number of roundtables, among other, and written white papers, among other things, at Columbia with the help of David Sandalow and Jason Bordoff, and many of the esteemed colleagues that have been here today, Audrey and Richard and John Wellinghoff, among many, many others. So we've spent some time thinking about this issue, and I was going to say that a lot of things have already been said, but then Ladine said that too. So now I have to think of something else to say. I guess we've been operating all day, sort of listening to the story about how grid evolution, and we've done this through the lens of transmission because I think it's important. I think we've been to, I know Jigger and I have probably been on enough panels If we had a nickel for every panel we've been on, we might actually be wealthy.
We'd be able to buy one Starbucks
Yeah,
coffee.
which is not cheap, I might add. We'd get the Grande or the Venti or something. So but we've talked a lot about this from the distributed side, right? So how does distributed energy impact the grid? How does in working from the customer side of the meter? And I think transmission really has been left out of the conversation. And maybe there's a reason for that, and maybe a legitimate reason, or maybe we've just been myopic. And I think this conference has been great because I personally have gotten a lot out of it, just trying to reframe my understanding of the issue, looking at it from the role transmission plays and what are the forces that are going to drive us to either add more transmission or take it away. So thank you all for having me, and I really do appreciate the comments from many of the speakers here today, even if I can't thank you all individually. I guess the one thing so we've been talking about transmission and moving forward in a fairly highly regulated structure with rate-basing assets and getting a rate of return under a much more traditional utility model. We've also talked about that shouldn't be evaluated on its own merits. It needs to be evaluated as part of a larger system planning operation, and IRPs should tell us, as I think Wellinghoff said this morning, that should tell us what kind of market structures we need to put in place in order to obtain the necessary character and amount of transmission capacity. But the problem is that as has been admitted many times today, that process of planning is flawed, right? It doesn't actually go long enough in terms of, it certainly doesn't, if you're going to do proper planning, you need to plan over the same time horizon of the asset that you're putting in place. And these transmission lines are not 10-year assets, which is largely what the planning is done through the IRP processes that exist. So you can't do a 10-year plan for a 40-year asset. Otherwise, you're going to miss something. And frankly, when you get 10 years out, the value of that asset is going to be worth what people expect it's going to be used and value it's going to create over the remaining 30 years on a discounted value at some appropriate interest rate. And if it's no longer useful, then not only do you have a stranded asset, but the returns on that investment, that original investment, aren't nearly what you thought they were going to be from either a financial or a social perspective. But we've been operating kind of in this, and what I hear is this bifurcated mind. It's like we do need to do all that new integrated planning. Yes, we all agree we should do it a little bit better. But what we aren't really, but at the same time, we're just going to go put in some more transmission where we think it's necessary, and we're going to run this through the normal processes that we're very comfortable with, and get it approved and get it cited. And the reason that we allow ourselves to live in this duplicitous mind is because we think that once we put that transmission in place, we will still get paid for it. So we go through the process. We go through the regulatory, we go through our financial analysis and the siting process and all those pesky, what did you call them? The pesky opposition, and we get them all quieted down. And we get this stuff not only approved, but eventually we get it built. And we're fine, right? The rules protect us. So how many of you are familiar with the Market Street Railway case? It's a Supreme Court decision of 1945. Raise your hand. So that's not enough. So let me tell you a story. I'm Southern. I do this in anecdotes. In the late 19th century, obviously, trolleys and trams and above-ground railways were very popular. They were, in many cases, publicly owned, as they were in San Francisco. Over some period of time, this was a heavily regulated industry. Fares were set by a Public Utilities Commission, or a version of a Public Utilities Commission. And eventually, they decided, because of the emergence of a number of private sector or third-party providers who wanted to do this, they were going to open it up so that these third-party providers could provide services at the same places and in competition with the existing publicly owned utilities or publicly regulated utilities. Does it sound familiar? So what happened is that eventually the economics began to deteriorate for those that had a large fixed infrastructure for delivering railway services, right? So they had lower utilization, they had to amortize that cost through rate increases to the remaining passengers, and finally in 1937, they tried to increase the fare from 7 cents to 9 cents or something per pass. Oh, those were the days, right? And they were told no by the Public Utilities Commission. They took this all the way to the Supreme Court and said, we've invested this money in this infrastructure, this people transmission infrastructure, that would allow them to, and we were promised that we would get a fair return on that investment. And the Supreme Court basically said, looking at the data and the analysis, you invested in things that weren't ultimately going to be economically viable. Even though the Public Utility Commission allowed you to make those investments, you invested in things that were not viable. And because you should have known better, you're not allowed to recover the cost of those assets. 1945, the Supreme Court issued this judgment. I think that when the utility, when today's transmission and fully integrated utilities start to realize that at some point the presumption will change, and putting in 40-year assets that may not have useful life or useful value creation after 10 years isn't as well protected as they think, I think people will start taking this much more seriously and force us out of this duplicitous mind that we find ourselves in. So, you know, I don't know when that'll happen. It took 70 or 80 years from start to finish in the railway case, but I'm not sure, and I'm not sure it'll take that long in this particular case because of the precedent, but it's something worth thinking about. With that, I'll turn over the panel.
Thank you. Rudy?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rudy Winter with National Grid. I thank you for the invitation. I applaud this conference because all too often we're talking about the clean energy debate and we talk about it in terms of resources, whether it's hydro, wind, or solar, and we don't talk about transmission in that at all. And I think transmission is an inextricable part in helping us to achieve these goals. It's going to be hard, for me, it's hard to see us hitting our long-term decarbonization goals in this country and in this state without large-scale renewables and transmission bringing those large-scale renewables, which are very often in remote locations, to load centers where people need that energy. So thank you for putting this on. Thank you for inviting me. Being the last panel of the day, you don't want to repeat a lot of the things that you've heard, so I'm going to streamline some of my comments. I was kidding Mark before, and I told him, no, you're going to hear it all over again. But I won't do that. I mean, suffice it to say, absolutely, we believe that there are a number of opportunities in New York, and we're playing a role in a number of those, to eliminate some congestion. Part of the New York Transco, with myself and other transmission owners in New York, are part of, going through a competitive solicitation to relieve that north-south interconnection congestion that we have. Looking at the western part of the state, how do we unlock some of the hydro assets that NYPA has? And National Grid submitted 2 proposals in western New York to help do that. And we hope that will give the PSC and the New York ISO some ability to do some trade-offs, look at reliability, look at the economics, and look at both proposals and hopefully move forward successfully with one of those. But suffice it to say, building transmission isn't enough. I think we heard from Paul and others about how technology can be used to help us really reduce the cost of our existing assets by optimizing those better and all those new benefits to our end-use consumers. So we see transmission, whether you're building new to relieve constraints, eliminating some congestion, providing benefits to end-use consumers, bringing clean energy to end-use consumers, as well as, like I mentioned before, unlocking some other value and bringing those to end-use consumers by using innovation and using technology to help us look at our assets differently, plan for them differently, use predictive models, and use new tools. We take looking at things like online monitoring of our transmission system as something we think is going to be paying dividends in the future, and are making some investments in moving forward and looking at that very hard today. As well as other tools that are out there, whether it's battery storage or some other technologies. We firmly believe that battery storage, and we've produced some and responded to some RFPs for battery storage on the South Fork of Long Island, should be a tool that utilities use, and it should be something utilities should be able to own and put in their tool basket as another solution to meet their T&D needs. And as I said before, when I made some comments, when we look out into the future, everything is going to be changing. We internally started building our own strategy, we call it Connect 21, to say how do we as National Grid respond to that changing world. We've got one side, large public policy pressures to deliver certain results. On the other side, we have consumers demanding new experiences and demanding new services as well. Having said that, as I mentioned before, we see three big things that have to happen. Number one, we firmly believe we have to, what we call, put the customer in charge. We've done some pilots in Massachusetts where we have given consumers additional technology and additional information and additional incentives, and they make better choices. By better choices, I mean they're using energy more efficiently. That's the better choice. So we see that they're doing that. Secondly, we've got to, and I said before, embrace technology partners. That is not something we think we do well as a company, and I'd say that's not something we do well as a sector. But that's absolutely what we're going to have to do if we want to meet the goals that we have in front of us and transform this sector the way we all want to transform it. And third and finally, it was, I think, the theme and the start of the day, we've got to change that business model, the regulatory model. What are we getting incented for? The regulatory model works really well because it drives accountability. Drives accountability around safety, accountability on reliability. That is extremely, extremely important. We can't ignore that. But it really doesn't incent you to take certain innovative risks. And that's where we've got to look at a different model for us to hit our goals in the future.
Thank you. Jigar.
That's good. Thanks, Ladine. Jigar Shah, I am probably here because I founded SunEdison in 2003. But right now I'm a co-founder and president of Generate Capital, where we're funding the deployment of a lot of these grid edge solutions as well as other resource efficiency solutions into the marketplace. I think I'm going to make my thoughts slightly more disparate just because I'm going to try to fill in some blanks that I didn't hear today in the panels. I think Chris King had a great conversation about what they're doing in Oklahoma. I just want to put in context what he was saying. Nest thermostats and other smart thermostats in the United States are deploying so many thermostats that they're controlling roughly an additional 500 to 700 megawatts of new capacity a month, right? And so that's where we're headed, right? So, and that number is accelerating, right? So now the fact that they haven't actually done anything with it is sort of, criminal for Alphabet, but it is what it is. But they do have the ability to control 500 to 700 megawatts of new capacity a month. The other thing I would say is that, since 1980, 70% of the net incremental generation that we've installed in this country has been for air conditioning, right? And so we should be cognizant of the fact that this is not a demand response problem, right? I mean, I think we constantly talk about demand response and LED lights and how Walmart wants to shut off half their lights in the ERCOT market or whatever. This is purely an unadulterated air conditioning problem. And when you talk to folks in Austin, with their work, et cetera, they will come back to you and say, with all of their instrumentation and all the DOE money that they spent down there, that the residential markets down there is purely, that something like 90% of all the volatility in the electricity usage on those circuits are air conditioning related, right? And so we have an air conditioning problem. And I think Vincent has sort of talked about that a little bit in his questions. And so one of the things that I would say to you is, I love solar, and I love the fact that I'm on the board of NYSERDA, and in the last quarter, we actually processed 9,000 solar applications, which NYSERDA has never been able to process 9,000 of any application. And so you can imagine how much wonderful software and other stuff that we've done. But the purpose of solar, for me, is not all of this stuff that makes everybody happy. It's to finally get the sales force and all of the innovation around distributed generation resources, to have a level of maturity such that they can solve other problems like HVAC, right? I mean, and so if we were to set out at SunEdison to start the HVAC power purchase agreement, we would have gone bankrupt within a week. It's very difficult to do that stuff. But now that solar is, signing on thousands and thousands of customers a month, now that we have over 100,000 salespeople across the country, Solar City has 200,000 solar advocates who are part-time solar salespeople for one company alone. You now see that you actually have this asset by which you can actually sell things that really matter, which is not distributed solar, although I love it dearly, but it's actually solving the HVAC problem in this country. And so I do think that it's important for us to realize where this is going, and that solar is really sort of the camel's nose under the tent, or the tip of the spear, or whatever sort of outdated analogy that you want to use. So that's another disparate comment. The third disparate comment I'd make is that there is constantly this conversation about transmission, which I'm not opposed to having. But for those of us who've been part of this process for a long time, a couple things are true. One is that generation costs in this country have gone down on a real basis over the last 15 years. And so all of the rate increases that we've experienced since 2000, which have been substantial for the C&I community, has been entirely on the T&D charges. And so for those people whose rates are going up by double to triple the rate of inflation since the year 2000, there is a reason why they all hate the utility rate making process right now, and it's because of T&D charges, not because of generation charges. So this includes Walmart and Costco and Macy's and Whole Foods and lots of others who are actually participating in rate cases now. So you actually have a really hard time getting some of these rate increases through because of these guys. Second is that the Bush administration in 2007 did give themselves eminent domain powers and expanded powers to be able to solve this problem. When I used to attend all the transition team meetings at DOE when Obama got elected, they couldn't stop talking about transmission and how they were going to really take these powers and figure out a way to solve it. And it is hard. Why? Because, for those of you who know what happened in Colorado, Louis Bacon owns a huge ranch. And he said, I don't want it going through my ranch because I bought this ranch so I could hunt, and I can't hunt next to transmission lines. So there are a lot of powerful billionaires who basically, call up the White House and say, I don't want this transmission line going through my property. So when Scientific American publishes yet another useless report about how we can actually power the entire country with HVDC lines coming from Nevada or coming from, the middle of the country, I laugh and, slightly throw up in my mouth. And I'm tired of it because this is a political challenge, right? And for those of us who work hard every day to make this happen, we have different roles to play. My role is, as an entrepreneur, is to make money within 6 months of when I actually take my investors' money, right? So for those folks who represent grid edge technologies, which Audrey Zilberman was one of those people, she had a very hard time of it. Why? Because she, wasn't able to change the system within the PJM and other places within the 5 years that, she had venture capital. And so when you think about these companies, they are largely going out of business trying to be right. And so I have vowed not to try to be right, but instead to be successful. And when you're trying to be successful, you try to figure out exactly where the pain medication is necessary in the marketplace. One of my best advisors said to me, Jigger, please stop selling vitamin pills. You want to be selling pain medication. And so we're trying to find people who are in extreme pain, who are willing to pay for the Vicodin that I'm selling to actually take to solve that problem, right? And some of that pain medication comes from Abigail's great work over at Earth Justice. And some of that pain comes from the fact that some of these commercial C&I customers have had rate increases that are double or triple the rate of inflation, and their revenues haven't gone up that fast. And so electricity is cutting into their available revenue to do their good work. And so I loved the conversation about transmission. I'm happy to have that conversation about transmission, but I think you're talking about timescales that we no longer have the luxury or privilege to have. And so I don't think that transmission is going to play a big role going forward. I think you're going to see debottlenecking transmission projects that our good friends are in the private sector are doing 300-mile, 700-mile extensions. But I don't think you're going to see large transmission projects going forward in this country.
Lots to think about there, and I have several questions. Please, a round of applause. I'm going to actually begin, though, by opening it up to the audience, and I'm going to ask, Travis Bradford has to leave, so I'm going to ask that if folks have questions for Travis, that we raise those first, and then we'll turn to more of a discussion. with
Don't feel obligated. You can ask all of us. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. I had a pre-existing plane flight that I can't miss. So.
I was going to say the first panel that has no
Got
question.
Hey, no, it-
We
It was a
clearly
long- it
didn't
was a
say
long day.
enough.
yeah, exactly.
With the possible exception of Mr. Winter, can I assume that the panel would look at transmission as the last possible solution, given the 40-year commitment?
No, I mean, for me, it's political. It's not technical. We can certainly talk about the engineering sort of necessities of transmission, but I think when you think about the way in which the utility planning process works today, it starts with generation, which they're obsessed about doing, and then they're like, crap, we can't actually move that generation to where the load pockets are. We have to build transmission. And then there's that side conversation at the end around, oh, we should do some energy efficiency or DSM programs. I think that, 45 years after Emory Lovins has published his piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, I think there is some desire on my part to start with the customer and to put the customer at the center and figure out a way to actually push off a lot of these capital improvements by changing customer load profiles first, and then seeing whether there's intrinsic load demand growth that requires new generation, and then figuring out whether there needs to be upgrades to the T&D system to be able to bring that generation to those new loads. But I just think that,
Agree, transmission comes last.
No, it's not that I agree that transmission comes last. It's that I feel very strongly that transmission is politically very difficult to do. And I think that we plan these transmission things to create straw men on purpose for us to say, oh, those pesky or Justice people or Sierra Club people or whatever people, like they're basically, killing our dreams of bringing Midwest wind to Chicago. And, the reality of the situation is that I don't think that the planning processes have tried genuinely to solve these problems using much lower cost Internet of Things technologies like Nest thermostats.
So, to carry on that point, I don't think it's about first or last. I think it's about doing the analytics correctly, and it could actually be first. I mean, there's some fabulous examples of interconnection transmission right now to help get the three major interconnects together. There is an excess of power in Quebec that needs to come down. I think there are always going to be high load centers that need bulk power transmission that are not necessarily near the lowest cost generation, even when you lay in the cost of transmission to get it there. So I think that we have to make sure we don't have our thumb on the scale and that we're analyzing it correctly. If the correct analysis over the correct time horizons that correctly account for the capital costs that Jigger was referring to are fully accommodated, then we actually might find that transmission is the best way to interconnect grids. Largely, these are going to be things with very high capacity factors. I think the Vermont Green Line is a fabulous example of this. High capacity factors. It's got some directionality to it, some flexibility and directionality to it. It's picking up a number of different sources along the way, and therefore it can be utilized at that higher capacity factor. And on a per unit of sort of value of service delivered, it's creating actually fairly high returns for the investment necessary. That's all. Those opportunities will always exist. But there's this gray zone of where we're not actually conducting the analysis correctly, as I pointed out, where we are probably making affirmative decisions despite our best efforts and despite the hard work of many people that are trying to make sure that we're not investing poorly. But if the test is set up in a certain way to pass fail, and it passes, we're going to be more likely to do it. Even if that test was set up incorrectly in the first place, and that's the concern. And I think that the weight of the evidence suggests that our time horizons are too short. We're not fully accommodating the full set of costs of doing a number of transmission projects in addition to the political capital, and we're not fully incorporating we're not actually doing the shadow price correctly on this, because the current and future trajectory of all of these grid edge or technologies to deal with distributed generation, on-site buffering and storage, the smart grid management, the even demand response, right? I think we're underestimating how cheap that's going to get as a solution set over the period of 40 years. So if we can get all that correct, and it's still the first best option is transmission, amen, let's do it.
And one thing I would say is, I agree with everything that was said, and I think we're at a point now where we need so much energy innovation, it's hard pressed to say we should take anything off the table. I mean, and in terms of transmission, it's not about first or last, but I wouldn't say transmission is always the first answer. By and large, the first answer has to be, can we do it with demand? Can we do it with demand response? Can we do it with energy efficiency? When you look at some of the federal reliability standards that you have to model against, it's hard pressed to say, I can meet those standards with demand response and enough energy efficiency, and very often I have to do a model for transmission as well. But then ultimately, when you cite it, you have to produce with a third-party economics firm the non-wires alternative and say, what would it have cost if you did this without transmission as well?
Great. Are there other questions? John?
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask a question instead of making a pronouncement. I know that'll be a refreshing change for people. In our work at the Americans for Clean Energy Grid, we've learned a couple things that we think a lot of people don't recognize about transmission. And that is, not merely is transmission irreplaceable for having access to resources that are off the grid. Now, we can only move electricity by wire. So if we're going to get access to the rich resources of renewable energy we have, we've got to build wires to it. But what we found is that when you do that, and you have a modern, integrated, smarter transmission system, you not only get access to that energy, but you improve it. You get a mitigation of the variability of renewable energy by the broader regional access that you're providing, so that the availability of the wind and the sunshine, it's always shining someplace or blowing someplace, rises and makes that energy more valuable to the market. But more than that, when you provide that access into an integrated market, that's when the renewable energy, with its unique feature of having a zero variable cost for lack of any fuel cost, can penetrate that market against anything else, pushes everything else off at the margin. And that means that the reward to the developer of the renewable energy and to the use of that transmission is higher than one would expect if it was one is thinking this is a variable source that is not going to be provided at the base load and is not going to compete against the coal, nuclear, gas, or other things. And it's not clear to me that transmission planners, much less others, are taking account of the extra values that transmission can bring in moving towards a clean energy economy, and that taking account of that might offset some of the difficulty we have in weighing a 40 or 50 year life asset against the quarterly or annual or 3-year cycles of venture capital or Wall Street. And what I'd love to have our two financial experts answer is, how will the financial community be able to wrestle with the underlying values of a longer term asset, be it transmission or a new nuclear plant or other things that really, simply cannot respond in the short cycle of financial thinking and business cycles?
Well, some smart person's going to come up with a solar PPA model. Oh, wait. And then some other smart people convert it into a lease form, and essentially they're going to contract differently. I mean, this is the true innovation on the distributed side. I don't know why I'm telling this. It's your story, man. But I think that the way the financial community has gotten around some of these long-lived assets is that they've basically attached a different surety of repayment. Now that's pushed the risks onto the customer, which is something that the existing grid operations and regulatory structure has insulated the customer from for a very long time. And that's sort of a core part of the model that's got to change. With the customers themselves are going to have to take on some of this performance risk. We can mitigate some of this technologically as well. I mean, you mentioned that storage is a great way to deal with the intermittency issues, but it's not the only way. And when I think distributed generation, I don't just think about solar, which I also love. But there are a number of forms of distributed generation, and I think I'm a huge fan of. I mean, natural gas was the original distributed generation, and it's continuing to play a very large role. And I think we're going to see that get smaller and even closer to customer siting with the advent of non-combustion technologies like more fuel cells, but at both the commercial and the residential level. So I think that there's a port, and then of course you figure out how to island that, and you got yourself a microgrid, right? So, and you've got as many cheap kilowatt hours as you can. You can firm it up with some additional form of generation or some combination of additional generation plus storage, and you've got yourself a microgrid. And all of a sudden, you may have an alternate way of dealing with intermittency that's cheaper. My concern is that the cost of this is where sort of, putting in a power line that you're going to use for, a transmission line that you're going to use for 40 or 50 years, you're going to have to pay for that over that period of time. And to the extent that you don't use it, then your constructed cost per unit of value it creates, skyrockets. But if you're sort of building out the capacity in a more, you're sort of using the customer pain points to sell them the Vicodin wherever they need it, then you're actually building this out in order to meet sort of the changing load and supply and demand conditions in those local markets, and you've got more sort of ways that you can ensure repayment. You end up with a lower cost of capital anyway, and something that can continue that is going to continue to get cheaper as you're rolling it out to more and more of these points. At the same time, your constructed cost of your transmission line is going to go up. I mean, it's the death spiral problem. It's just moved from the distribution grid to the transmission grid. So I think that as you pointed out, the innovation has to happen on the finance side, but I think the innovation, it's happening through the intermediary companies, the SunEdisons, the Solar Cities, but it does require the customers to be more involved and take a little bit more risk, but at a certain cost, they're going to be willing to do that.
So I can answer the question from a slightly different perspective. So there's been a couple of really groundbreaking contracts that have been signed recently by Microsoft and Kaiser Permanente and others, where they're actually signing. Steelcase, I guess, just did one yesterday for Apex Wind, where they're signing the PPAs for centrally stationed wind farms, and then, wheeling that power to their facilities, right? I think which is kind of what you're saying. The challenge with that and the financing, so those are clearly getting financed, right? The customers are actually taking the PPA risk and they're offsetting it with what they perceive to be wholesale power risks, and they're using it basically as a hedge against their own natural gas costs in whatever balancing market that they're buying from. And so, so that's interesting. I would say that right now we've got a bead on roughly 50,000 megawatts of those contracts that can get signed over the next 3 years. We'll see whether, that number can get up to 100,000 or so, which it's harder to see how it gets there because you have to use buying co-ops to get up to that level where you can have individual credits do the 50,000 megawatts. One of the challenges that we have as energy developers and then financiers of those developers is that the process of figuring out whether there's transmission capacity to transport that power from where it's being generated to where it's needing to go is not something that we really have a fair shot at influencing, right? So that generally is an outsourced conversation to the electric utility companies or their consultants to tell us. And so, I do think that that's probably another job for Abigail, where I do think that with 70,000 megawatts of coal plants coming offline, it's important for folks like SmartWire, but then you guys to come in and sort of say, well, how much capacity does that actually free up? How do we actually move stuff there? We obviously can improve those transmission lines without necessarily needing new right-of-ways to put in next-generation technologies to increase capacity. My sense is that alone actually gets you most of the way there. And then what Travis was talking about at the end there was that there is an insurance cost, which is, the microgrid concept, right? So at some point, you go through all of that analysis, and for some customers, it may end up being cheaper just to generate their own power locally, right? And so, that is an analysis that can be done nationwide through a couple of supercomputers, and it is something that DOE, I think, does have a responsibility of doing under the Clean Power Plan, analysis.
Bill, I'm sure you were going to say something about bulk and generation versus transmission costs.
Is that, okay, you can hear me. Bill White, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for everybody all day. It's been amazing. So one question I had is about, we certainly recognize the political difficulty that you articulated, Jigger, of building transmission. It's staggering. And I think no one in this room who's ever been involved in that process would disagree with that. It's pretty much the hardest infrastructure you can build anywhere in the United States or North America. But one question I have is, can you talk a little bit more about this sense of risk of investment in these assets? And the reason I ask that is that we already know where RTOs and other transmission planners have taken proactive steps to build transmission, to go get renewables, and do that all in, it's highly beneficial to ratepayers. That's ERCOT, California RETI, MISO MVP, SPP, and in fact, the overwhelming majority of renewables that we have in the United States today are a direct result of those efforts. So we know that happened. We know that they're highly beneficial, and in every case where people have gone back and looked again at the transmission that was built, the only thing they've decided to do is build more. Because the benefit-cost ratio of those investments to ratepayers, bottom line, all in, were so high. So the question is, knowing that, are we really, back to you, Travis, are we really, where are we on that curve? I mean, are we really at risk for building things, I call it the stranded transmission line, the unicorn. I want to see one. I haven't seen it yet for renewables. Maybe it's out there. Maybe I will live to see it. I haven't seen it yet. And so are we guarding against the risk that we really don't know to be that high yet? I accept the fact that, whenever you commit to a 40, 50-year infrastructure project, there's a risk. There's no question about it. When we've done that for renewables so far, they've kind of paid off in spades. And in fact, again, we go back, the benefits look bigger. In MISO MVP, 3 years later, the benefits were bigger. California RET, on and on. And so at some point, that's not going to be true, for sure. I would certainly agree with that. And I would agree also that there's a lot of technological upgrades to the transmission that we do have that can open up a lot more capacity. But I just throw that out there in terms of the risk. And do we, by avoiding projects that have such high benefit cost ratios or seeking to avoid them, doing the projects on the demand side doesn't mean we necessarily should avoid highly beneficial projects on the transmission side. So I guess I want to get your thoughts on that.
I can give you my quick thought and then push it over to Travis and Rudy. But I think, at least, I've done a tremendous amount of advocacy in the last 15 years. I don't remember ever opposing a transmission line. I've never been a party to oppose a transmission line. So I think they fall under their own weight, right? I don't think it's because I've worked hard to kill one of those things. It's normally a landowner or somebody else in the process. I don't think it's a solar guy who's wanting to do more distributed generation who's basically trying to kill transmission. So I think it's, I agree with you. But it's more because the process is so contentious and so difficult that when you get one transmission line through, well, of course it's going to be a huge ROI because, it had 7 brothers and sisters that got killed before, that one got got put in. So I don't know who exactly you're looking at to change their approach. My sense is that there are some environmental groups who oppose transmission lines, but because of, their lipstick on a pig, they're like, oh, it's for wind, but actually 80% of it's for a coal or something. And so there's some that have, opposed transmission lines, but I don't
sorry,
know that.
my memory's a little fuzzy, but what about Sunrise Power Link? I think the basic argument there was it's not, based on capacity factors and the cost of putting in the transmission line, I thought I remembered us looking at analysis that said...
Oh, yeah, no, the analysis that was done by, was it Bill... what was the guy's name at San Diego Foundation?
Fuzzy, remember
yeah,
Fuzzy.
mean, Bill Powers, I think, right?
Yeah.
The analysis made it very clear that distributed generation in that case would have been 1/7 the cost of building Sunrise Power Link with interest charges. But I don't remember lifting a finger to oppose it. I mean, that was the deal that San Diego Gas and Electric cut, on the side with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and
Sure,
so we got
but in that
done.
particular case, and now this goes back 7 years, right? But in that particular case, the distributed alternative for meeting the same amount of power requirements with the same intermittency issues wasn't actually allowed to be considered in terms of the economic comparisons.
Yeah.
So back to, as long as we compare it correctly, I think it needs to it can and doesn't make sense. It's just sort of, after having watched the cost of solar fall so quickly, and we all have now. I mean, I've perhaps been watching it slightly longer than many people because I wrote a book that was about 5 years too early on this. But
I loved it, Travis.
Thanks, Jigger. Once I finally spelled your name correctly. We had we've been watching this for a long time, and there's no reason to believe that the trajectory on that technology, the trajectory on fuel cell technology, the trajectory on batteries, and certainly the efficiency with which some of the software innovations to sort of manage load and these integrated components on the grid edge aren't going to get dramatically cheaper. And so it's just my basic concern is that none of us, we're going back and looking at 6 years ago, solar was, residential solar was $6 or $7 a watt, and it's now what, $2.50? And to expect that we have some sense about how cheap the more distributed alternatives are going to be, and how robust we can make them in terms of meeting the performance requirements, which are absolutely vital to having always-on, low-cost, low variability in both economic and physical performance terms. We have to meet that test. I'm not sure we have to meet the 99, or the 6 nines test. But I think we can get to 4 nines pretty cheaply with a lot of these technologies, and the world's going to look radically different. So I just think we need to make sure that our models are accommodating those disruptive aspects of the set of alternatives, and that's my main point.
And Bill, one thing I'd add, I think with the new competitive landscape that we have, you're not just going to see transmission projects competing against transmission projects, because very often other solutions are put forward. So I think that is another factor that'll come into play here to make sure we're making the right choices, provided that whoever's making that selection is looking at a wide gamut of criteria.
Great, yes, lots of provocative thoughts here, so we'll open it up. Thank you, Travis, very much.
Thanks, Travis.
The speakers throughout the day were talking about the land requirements for transmission lines. Another issue with solar opponents raise is the land requirements for generation itself. That solar requires more land to generate than most other sources. Sun Edison itself has done a project in India and Gujarat where they did canal top solar. Considering the US state of California and maybe a few other states have droughts, and they're doing other drought-proof measures to combat that, I'm surprised that there is no canal or lake top solar in the US.
So let me just broaden the answer to that. So I often get these questions about land availability. So let me just give you guys a few data points. So the amount of paved surfaces that we have in the United States, parking lots and parking spaces, could basically fill the entire state of Connecticut. And so it's 6,500 square miles. To power the entire, to power the entire country, which you would never do with solar, in terms of megawatt hours or terawatt hours, would be about 10,000 square miles. So, there's a lot of parking spots, right? In New York State, the amount of land that we've lost just from the lakes that are formed behind hydro dams could power the entire state with solar. So we lose land all the time for lots of reasons. If you just took all the brownfield land in the United States and covered it with solar, you'd power the entire country. So there isn't really a land problem, whether it's in India or whether it's in other places. The challenge I think that we're talking about here is figuring out how supply equals demand, right? Because solar is only providing power during the day, and figuring out how to get 24/7 power is the challenge. And And so what I would say is that, like I said before, I love solar, and it certainly captures the imagination and has this sort of response rate. Like, when NYSERDA picked up the New York Sun program, we got over 100 new companies that formed and thousands of new employees and, investment and all those things that you just don't get from energy efficiency and other sort of programs that NYSERDA launches. But, the part that I think we're deeply missing in this country, and it's something that I think is coming quickly now, is these grid edge technologies. I think the technology to be able to provide the level of insight to the grid operations groups at the utilities to really better manage their assets are there, and it's not integrated into their operations. And it's creating this enormous blind spot that these entrepreneurs are paying for. And I think what you hear Richard, saying is basically that they're no longer going to sit on the sidelines as hundreds of companies go out of business because their technologies have taken way too long to get implemented into the grid. I think that is the underlying thing that you're hearing him say. And there's just too many companies that ran out of time because of a death by 1,000 pilots.
Jim.
Excuse me. Excuse me. My name is Jim Gallagher, and I'm director of an organization called the New York State Smart Grid Consortium. And about 6 years ago, I was head of energy policy for the city, and we put together what was the city's first transmission plan. And I know there was some discussion earlier about, can we get a third party or an independent party doing transmission planning? And at that time, we found that process so incredibly helpful that we were independently able to assess options, transmission versus energy efficiency, renewables, offshore renewables. And one other option, which was incredibly attractive that hasn't been discussed at all today, and I was wondering if what your thoughts are, whether it's still a live option, was in-city repowering of inefficient older power plants. I mean, we found that actually the economic impacts of that and the environmental impacts were so dramatic compared to building new transmission into the city, that it was our number one preferred option. It didn't end up getting selected in the state process. But I guess my major point is, and a question, what is the role of repowering now as a potential alternative in addition to renewables and efficiency? And then second, can't other communities or cities and municipalities be doing their own planning, or at least independent assessment, third-party assessments?
I'll start to answer your first part of your question about the role of repowering. I think repowering is a very, very powerful tool. I've got about 4,000 megawatts of generation on Long Island. Looking at some of the larger plants that are out there, repowering those. And repowering those, I'll add with a plant that is cleaner for the long term, less expensive than the existing plant, and also have increased output from the plant. So we put together some proposals, put it in front of Long Island Power Authority on those specifically. That was the first part of your question. The second part of your question, I think, was around should communities do their own, was it planning? What was your second part, Jim? Yeah. Yeah, the size of New York City, you're able to do it. I think smaller communities end up doing it by proxy if they have a good siting process. If they have a good, robust siting process, that's going to challenge a transmission developer like me or someone else to walk in and say, why are you putting up a transmission line, number one? Show me the analysis, not done by you, done by someone else, that proves that this is the cheapest way of delivering and solving this problem. So I think smaller communities, if they get involved in the siting process, that could act as a proxy for them not having the resources that New York City has to do their planning. And the last point I'd make around that is and we said it time and time and again, just really hard to build anything. And to be honest with you, one of the things we found that is probably the most effective is getting out there, doing town hall meetings, doing meetings in the community, and explaining projects long before it gets to the siting board. So people have a chance to understand why you're doing it. They have a chance to challenge it, to challenge the analysis. The more you communicate, the earlier you communicate, as difficult as it is, I think in the long term it pays off because it makes you sharper, it makes you sometimes change routes or change ideas from overhead to underground because of it as well. But I think there's no getting around the value of getting out there and speaking to the communities that you're quite frankly going to disrupt with your infrastructure. Jigar?
I don't know that I have much to add. I completely agree with Rudy. I mean, I do think, just maybe commenting slightly on the politics of repowering. Clearly New York State has a very active and robust anti-fracking lobby. And to the extent that the repowering was to be done with natural gas, my sense is that you would have the power, full faith and credit of that power, that descends upon the city of New York. And I don't know that the current mayor of New York has the spine to sort of figure that out.
Great. Paul?
Follow up, Jigar, on your last comment about the death by 1,000 pilots, and I know Rudy has talked about new business models. I've written about regulatory models and talked some today about business models. But if you're thinking about what it is going to take to avoid that death by 1,000 pilots and actually get some of these smart grid edge technologies into the marketplace, what do those new business models look like, and what's the role of the utility and the utility regulator in making those happen?
It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer, but what I would say is that clearly the demand response, Supreme Court case has been helpful, because that's one of the revenue streams that folks are looking at in California and in PJM's territory. One of the ways to get around it, so we did a lot of work with Walmart, who is its own utility in ERCOT's territory, to implement a lot of grid edge technologies for Walmart, and so that's interesting. I think some of the retail electricity providers like IGS, Direct Energy, Ethical Electric, I think they're looking at doing grid edge technologies for their own customers, to be able to grow into new revenue streams for their retail companies. But I've lost faith in the ability for the utilities to implement grid edge technologies. I mean, even if they were to implement the technologies, it's not clear that they'd get the full value out of them. Like, for instance, one of the compromise deals that the solar industry is looking at doing for net metering is to have the electric utility companies own all the inverters, right? Because since 1985, we've had analysis that show that there are 12 or 14 different value streams that the utilities can capture, including voltage and frequency and others, from the inverters technologies. And my sense is if we did that, it would be another 10-year process for me to force the utilities to actually do it, right? So first, I would get the compromise position to actually get them to rate base the inverters, right? So they get a bunch of money and have the ability to make some money off of it. But then I would have to go back to the Public Service Commission every year and say, they still haven't implemented the software improvements to actually, do this. They still haven't figured out the IoT stuff to do this, even though it's actually in the inverter. They just don't actually have the right communications protocol to be able to talk to them, right? And it's so frustrating that I feel bad, because I really don't want to be the guy who is like constantly talking about the utility death spiral. Like, that's not who I want to be, right? I kind of want the utilities to be around. I like them, but I don't.
Don't worry, we will.
No, but I'm very concerned that you won't be, because I think what'll happen is that your most powerful and most profitable customers are going to be the ones that I take over first. Right? It's the retailers, it's the data centers, it's the college campuses, it's the corporate campuses. Those are the folks who I'm going to go in and say, you know what? You haven't gotten all of the access to advanced technology that you've been promised. Let me just come in. I'll just buy your grid for $110 million. I'll go in. I'll just upgrade all of the services to give you that stuff, and I'll take you basically off grid. Right? I may not technically take them off grid, but I will threaten to take them off grid in order to negotiate a better interconnection agreement. And so I just think that that's where this is headed, and I don't want it to head that way, because it seems like a lot of work for me. It doesn't seem like something I actually want to sign up for. But I don't actually see any other way to do it. I mean, PG&E, even to this day, in 2007, when we negotiated the California Solar Initiative, we mandated all sorts of primitive IoT technologies in every single solar system that gets installed. Even today, they actually have no idea what any of the distributed generation resources in their territory is doing. And we're now at a point where we must be, I don't know, 5 to 8% of their total generation now in PG&E's territory, and they have no eyes whatsoever. Even though we actually have been forced to provide the data, so the data is already being streamed on a 15-minute basis to them, they have not integrated into their grid operations group. Tom Siebel spent $150 million on his own company with C3 to do this, and PG&E has no desire whatsoever to actually sign a contract with Tom Siebel for any of this stuff, with, even though he's got Connie Rice on his board and everybody else. So it's just, I don't know what else it's going to take, but we're not close.
I have a theory of what I think it's going to take, and I think terms like death spiral get a lot of good headlines, and it probably helps Travis write some good books, but doesn't get anything moving. And if we're really going to attack this problem, it's going to be a level of collaboration from regulators to utilities to developers to new technology providers, the likes of which we have never seen before. We're going to have to look at this as a system and not individual. And you know what? It's going to be a death spiral for some utilities. It won't be mine.
No, it won't be
We
yours.
will be acquiring those that we think are
I agree.
in danger, and we will extract that value, because I think, A, you've got to understand everything is changing. I said this before. You also have to understand what you're good at and what you're not good at. We don't think we are as good as we should be when it comes to innovation. And part of that is because we tried to make 14,000 employees think about being reliable and safe today and also being innovative today. We said, wait a minute, time out. There are certain parts of our business model we don't want you to be innovative. We want you to be safe and focus on certain procedures in certain parts of the business, and that's what we want you to do all day, every day. There are other things, the changing business model, customers migrating off of the grid, customers migrating to what they need to do, and we don't want to stop that. They're going to choices they want to make. That's where innovation is going to take place. So we said, instead of 14,000 people trying to think about it part-time, we set aside a group of individuals, and we said, we want you to think about this and chart our way to the future 100% of your time. That's the group that's doing our smart grid pilots in Massachusetts. That's the grid that's doing our microgrid in Potsdam, New York. That's the group that's doing our solar projects out of Buffalo for low-income customers. So it's all about trying to look at the future and rationalize your way back. Rationalizing your way back, a lot has to change. It's not just the utility.
Great, and I'll just wrap up by touching on a few of the points. We heard, I think we are going to need more situational awareness, to your point, and the technologies to get there. And it will require a systems approach. And then also, if we're looking at our goals in terms of climate and energy security, reliability, resilience, and affordability, I think we are going to need the transmission and the distribution. And we've heard a lot of the challenges. And we also heard about some of the stakeholder challenges. And I think one of the values of having an event like this today is bringing together a number of the stakeholders. I'm sure there are more that aren't in this room that we need to include going forward, but it's great to have this range of stakeholders together. And just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Longtime observers of the scene, to help us encapsulate the lessons of the day. David Sandalo, our colleague and co-host and leader of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and my colleague Bill White, who was Carol Browner's right-hand person on climate change back in the Clinton administration, and has kept his dedication to clean energy and all things. They're going to give you their initial take on the rich dialogue we've had today, but we want to stay in touch and are happy to, you'll see this conference is going to be posted, but let's keep the dialogue going. All right. So, which of you guys is going to go first?
This has been great. Many thanks to all our speakers and everybody who participated. We are going to do a written summary of this. We've had a great team of Columbia graduate students who are taking notes. We're going to produce it. We're going to distribute drafts to the speakers, and you're going to give us comments. So we'll circulate it in a couple weeks' time. We hope that'll be a helpful resource. I'm going to take a big risk and try to summarize what I heard. There was so much content. I feel confident that I will piss some people off because they'll think I got it wrong. But how's this for a 7-word summary for one of the top line messages that we heard today? Yes, we need transmission investments with caveats. I don't think I heard anybody say we don't need transmission investments. You know, there was definitely a range in terms of how full-throated people were on that. Some people did that very, very kind of with a lot of caveats. But I think I didn't hear anybody say we don't need transmission investments. The caveats, however, were a regular part of that statement. That's pretty interesting. I mean, there, you know, a lot of emphasis about yes, we need to do it, but we need to do it with the right analysis. Yes, we need it, but less than people think. Yes, we need it, but it's unclear how much transmission we're going to need and when. So a huge range of caveats, but a general consensus that yes, we're going to need transmission investments. So that's one top line I heard. I also heard that yes, REV is about transmission too. And both of our senior speakers from the state of New York highlighted that. Richard Kaufman said, and I quote, "REV is not just about distribution resources, it's about a strong backbone for the grid." And Audrey Zibelman said, "REV is about optimizing the entire system, not just about distribution." So the Reforming the Energy Vision, which is such an innovative process here, is often thought about just being distribution, but it's more than that. We heard a number of speakers talk about how this is not just technology, but also policy. Richard said quite clearly the challenge is less about technology than about policy. Jigger said it's political, not policy, which is a good point. So this is about a lot more than technology. We were really honored here to have 2 former chairs of the FERC, and had very good conversations about Order 1000. I was interested at the nobody gave a very good grade to the implementation of Order 1000 in the dialogue, and kind of the notion. I think it was Jim who said that the implementation has been spotty. Travis, I thought it was great, said you can't do a 10-year plan for a 40-year asset. And I think that was a theme that ran through some of the conversations. There was some real interesting conversation about technology. I thought there are tremendous presentations on that, talking about advanced power flow control, dynamic line reading, predictive analytics. Although there was an emphasis on the importance of policy and politics, there's a lot of dynamic developments in the technology sphere here that are going to make a difference. And then we also had great conversations about finance. Mike Eckhart from Citi emphasized how Citi, with $3 trillion a day or whatever he said that they're moving, Citi won't finance renewable energy assets without knowing that there's transmission offtake capacity. And so transmission is hugely important. So those are just a few of my quick thoughts about what we heard today. I know it was really rich. There's a lot more, and I just want to thank everybody for participating. Thanks.
So it's come to this. I'm standing between you and the exits. First of all, I want to say thanks to our outstanding hosts and partners here at Columbia. David and your team, you guys have been fantastic. And David and I were colleagues in the Clinton administration a long time ago, and it's just great to get back together. So thanks again, and thanks very much to all of our sponsors, National Grid and Barrick, Quebec, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but I'll say NYSEG. So thanks to all of you. I'll say that, my comments I'll summarize. I'll leave it with apologies to my alma mater, Harvard. I'll leave it to Columbia to summarize them, because I think they're going to do a great job, and I really look forward to that report. But I'll just make one overarching comment based on what struck me as one of the quotes of the day, given my background of 25 years working on the climate issue, and that is the runner-up quote of the day was, of course, lunch is ready, but the quote of the day belongs to Gil Quinones, I think, who may already have had to go. And what Gil said in the context of our long-term climate goals is that we're going to need everything. And everything I've heard today, reinforces that idea with me that we're going to need everything. And 25 years ago, when I was a much younger person working on climate change with David and a lot of other fantastic people, we couldn't say with confidence that we had solutions that we knew would get us to our goals. we can say that today, thanks to the technological and other advances that we've seen and the drop in the cost of renewable energy and energy efficiency and all the other tools that we have. We can say that with a lot of confidence today, and that's really exciting, and that makes me optimistic about where we're headed. That said, you know, most of the renewables, the overwhelming majority we have today, are there because transmission was built to get them and put them online. And even with that tremendous progress, we've still got to go even faster between now and 2050 to get where we need to go. So I would love to say that we don't need any more transmission to get where we're going. And you know, no one would be happier than me to say that, but based on what I know now and my career working on this, I think we still do. There may come a day when I'll agree that we don't. But let's also make sure that we take advantage of all the other solutions that are available, which are really exciting and moving forward really fast. And I think this group today did a great job of really advancing my thinking about how we put those things together and do it together and get all of those things done in the right measure as we move forward. So those are my closing thoughts, and I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming, and we look forward to staying in touch.